Hi, I'm Katie Crane, and this is the Pilates Lounge. Hi everyone, my name's Katie Crane, the Pilates professional. Welcome to another episode of the Pilates Lounge podcast. I am thrilled with the guest that has arrived in the studio today. I'm speaking to David Weinstock. Now, some of you will know David's work. I've been following David for a long time. I love reading his articles, and one of my dreams is definitely to get to a in-person seminar, but David does have a lot of online material to share with you if you are interested in understanding more about neurokinetic therapy. Let me introduce David. Now, David has been practicing and teaching manual therapy techniques since 1973. Now, that's like 3 years before I was even born, so he's a wealth of knowledge. David graduated from Johns Hopkins University as a pre-med student and then traveled extensively in Central and South America, learning from native healers and a variety of practitioners. He graduated from the New Mexico School of Natural Therapeutics in 1979. In 1985, David co-founded the Institute of Conscious Bodywork in Marin County, California. David's Neurokinetic Therapy bodywork system was developed in 1985 in collaboration with several peers. He taught many different classes at the Institute, including Advanced Anatomy, Carpal Tunnel Syndrome, TMJ, and Neurokinetic Therapy until 2005. David's book, Neurokinetic Therapy, An Innovative Approach to Manual Muscle Testing, was published in 2010, and since then has been translated into Japanese and Korean and is now in its second edition. David now travels nationally and internationally teaching chiropractors, physical therapists, personal trainers, massage therapists, and, of course, Pilates instructors. David still maintains a busy private practice in Marin County, California, using his neurokinetic therapy bodywork system to treat athletes and weekend warriors alike. Acute and chronic injuries and conditions are assessed and rehabilitated, and the client is sent home with an individualized exercise program. Now, this is a very impressive history that David has, and after reading quite a few of David's articles, I've kind of plucked out a couple of very relevant topics for us here on the Pilates Lounge, and I just know that the information that David is going to pull out of his extensive knowledge is going to absolutely blow us away. So hang in there, listeners. We've got so much information coming to you, but for now, I would love to welcome you to the show, David. Thank you so much for taking time out in your schedule. Could you, in your own words, introduce yourself to our listeners? So tell us a little bit about who you are and how did you get to the point that you are today in your career?
First of all, I thought you were going to ask me to pull out of a different part of my anatomy, but okay, whatever. So the bio, speaks for itself. I was pre-med at Johns Hopkins. My father was a doctor. I was supposed to be a doctor. And, the 60s happened and my mind got slightly altered by the 60s, let's put it that way. And I could never see things the same way again. And once that's possible, once I could see the interconnectedness of everything, I can no longer justify going to medical school. That whole philosophy was completely foreign to me. So I tried a little of this and I tried a little of that. And I found that I had a big interest in biomechanics. So I started adapting my work based on biomechanics. But again, people were coming back with the same problem over and over again. And I knew I was missing something. Finally, in the mid-1980s, I was turned on to a book called The Neural Basis of Motor Control. And it was my exposure to how the brain organized movement, directed everything, how everything worked together according to patterns in the brain. And how some of those could be functional and some of those could be dysfunctional. And combining the biomechanics with the neuroscience, I came up with a system that we now call neurokinetic therapy. So it's been in the works for almost 40 years now, and we've changed it a lot over the years. I have some brilliant students and practitioners who have contributed to the work, and it's exciting for me to see the young people coming and really taking over for me, which is really a compliment and allows me to feel good about my legacy. So I never expected this kind of reaction in the world when I started putting this stuff out on Facebook so long ago, and people would call me a liar and all kinds of stuff. You know how Facebook can be. And finally, it started to catch on, and I got invited to teach in Sydney in 2011. So I spent my 60th birthday in Australia in 2011. We had a lot of fun. Byron Bay was really, really nice. We enjoyed that. And I taught, and that was my first international. And then the next year came London, and then came Taiwan, and all of a sudden things just blew up, and we're on every continent in the world. Now, I don't travel as much as I used to because it's getting too hard on me. So I have wonderful teachers all over the world. We just had a teachers meeting, and there were 20 something people in the gallery from all over the world. It really hit me hard. It was incredible. So the work is wonderful, but it's not just about that. We have a wonderful online community, over 10,000 people, maybe 12,000, I don't know. And people help each other. I don't allow people to criticize and be mean to each other. So it's a very safe space to ask questions and to learn. And that's how I want people to behave, treat each other with kindness and compassion, add some intelligence to what they're saying. There's just too much meanness in social media these days. And I won't tolerate it. If any of my students misbehave like that, they're gone. So thank goodness I haven't had to do it very much. But, the kind of questions and comments I get on Facebook and Instagram, first of all, the spelling and grammar is horrendous. And then there's idiotic. And if you don't like what I do, just unfollow me. Why do you have to say something? Good God. So that's where we're at today.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like potentially you, at some stage, have been pushing the boundaries of the status quo, hey? Which, that's what understanding the body is all about, isn't it? So I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
If it wasn't,
I expected to get negative feedback because it's very threatening to people when a new paradigm comes on the scene. They feel like, oh my God, I don't know it, and I could lose my job, and all that stupid stuff that people put in their heads, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah. So could you explain to our listeners what is neurokinetic therapy, and how does it work, and in particular, how would a movement professional integrate neurokinetic therapy into their work?
Sure. We have a lot of Pilates people in our community, many, 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 many. One just moved back to Australia, friend Philip. She lives in Sydney. I think if Joseph were alive today, he and I'd be good buddies. In order to use a piece of equipment like the reformer properly, or do any of the other exercises, the brain has to organize that movement pattern in a correct fashion, in a functional way, so that you don't get injured when you do that particular movement. So for Pilates instructors, using NKT at the beginning of it, like in an intake, and making sure that that person can actually use that particular piece of equipment without compensating, without hurting themselves, is very, very important. And you can get much better and quicker results by giving people things that they can do properly, rather than things that they struggle with and get hurt by. So it's a wonderful, for Pilates, it's a wonderful first session kind of intake into how they move, what they do well, what they don't do well. So that's how movement people use it.
Okay. And explain, so within that first session, so say somebody comes in for an assessment, how might assessment be different using neurokinetic therapy, opposed to before I was using it? What might I be doing with that person?
Well, you normally would watch somebody go through, some mat exercises and, try and help them to succeed with those and then put them on the reformer. Well, how do you know when they're doing, the curl up, the Pilates curl up, that they're not cheating like crazy using the wrong muscle to compensate for something that's just not working at all? And if they do that over and over again, that can lead to injury, especially lower back injuries. So it's important to break down movement patterns for people to make sure that they are functional. If they're not functional, you fix it, and then you give them homework based on what you found to fix it before they go ahead and do a more progressed and complicated movement pattern. So we break things down into little tiny components, build them up until they're a full movement pattern again. So that's what you would be doing in a first session.
Okay, cool. So is it partly, am I looking at good things like good joint placement or over recruitment, under recruitment of muscles, or what am I generally observing?
Well, let's say you're watching somebody do a curl up. They're holding their breath and they're clenching their jaw and they're probably, puckering their pelvic floor while they're at it too, right? So that's not functional. That's cheating. And if they keep doing that, they're going to get hurt. Yeah. So you want to have somebody be able to do a curl up using their abs, using their psoas properly without all this other stuff compensating. And that's what you would be looking for. Once you get the training, you can then watch for these compensation patterns when people are moving. And some are universal, right? Clenching the jaw, holding the breath, pelvic floor, right? I mean, we all deal with that stuff. Now, I remember when I first started posting about pelvic floor, there was a big movement in Pilates just to tighten the pelvic floor to help the core. Oh boy, was that a disaster. And you guys aren't doing that anymore, thank God, because it was causing a lot of pelvic floor problems. So that's one of the reasons why NKT can be so valuable. You can see if the pelvic floor is overactive, underactive. What do you got to get it to do to function properly in a curl up? So there's a lot to look at in a first session.
Right.
But you do it, you get better at it and better at it. And, people come in now and start describing what they have, and I already know what I'm going to do. So it's just a matter of practice.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, thank goodness that whole movement of, I remember when I first started Pilates, maybe in 2004, and there was still that whole pelvic floor thing, right? Like elevate your pelvic floor and now do something. And then as a new instructor, what happens is when we're constantly cueing something, maybe without realizing it, we are then constantly doing it ourselves. I cannot tell you the issues that I ended up with from constantly elevating my own pelvic floor every time I was cueing someone else to do it. It took me years to unwind. Years, I tell you. But I mean, and I agree with, Pilates instructors who have, good training and good mentoring are no longer teaching that. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily across the board. And this is why I think we need to keep having these conversations, because unfortunately, not everybody does get the support that they deserve as a student instructor, but I'd like to think that most of us are hungry to continue learning. So could we dive into that a little bit? Could you please talk about pelvic floor, like what, overactive versus underactive? What are some common signs, symptoms, and relationships on other muscles? Just a quick little interruption to say a big thank you to listening to the Pilates Lounge podcast. This podcast is all about sharing our love of movement and Pilates with as many people as possible. So if you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to review us so that we can get the word out there. Also, if you haven't joined us on the Pilates Muse newsletter, it's a bi-weekly newsletter that shares a whole load of information with you. And we also have virtual online education programs. So if you're looking to get inspired and grow even more as a Pilates professional, check us out, www.thepilatesprofessional.com.au. Back to the show.
Of course, pelvic floor, I like to divide into two parts. One controls urination, other controls defecation. So when we tell somebody to engage their pelvic floor, like the anterior pelvic floor, we tell them to do Pegels. And when they do the posterior pelvic floor, we call those Pugels. Pugels. You got to have a little sense of humor. So common things that we find is pelvic floor can be overactive for the transverse abdominis or the psoas, right? Now, it can be also underactive in relationship to those same muscles. So you have to know how to test to see overactive and underactive. Now, somebody who has an overactive pelvic floor will have painful sex is a common one, frequent urination. But then again, underactive pelvic floor, you can have frequent urination as well. So that's why it's so important to be able to test the pelvic floor the way we do in order to determine if it's overactive and underactive. And then you can give homework based on that. It makes a huge difference. It really does. Pelvic floor, because it's part of your core, can compensate, the anterior part of the pelvic floor can compensate for the front line. The posterior part can compensate for the back line. So it's very involved in all movements of the body. Very, very involved. And we find it in relationship to jaw tension, breath holding, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't simply state what's more overactive, underactive. I find both. And getting people to release the pelvic floor when it's been so tight for so long is such a relief. And, the pelvic floor PTs, they're doing a lot of this work intraanally or intravaginally. And we find that unnecessary to be so aggressive with the treatment. You can pretty much treat all of this externally. So that's a big issue for a lot of people in the world. Big.
Yeah, as somebody who has lived with a very overactive pelvic floor, it was, that feeling of constantly needing to urinate, but then when you go, then there's not really anything there anyway. It's just that it's this constant, I don't know, it's almost like a tickle or it's you just, you're always working. But now understanding how the pelvic floor works, what feels really good is things like footwork on the reformer and feeling how the pelvis can open, how the sits bones can open as you're doing your footwork, and recognizing how the bones can actually move to allow for things to work better rather than always trying to connect with muscles.
Right. And if people are underactive pelvic floor, they urinate too much.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you have God, I have to go tinkle, but I really don't. And then it's like, where's the nearest bathroom? Right. So those are really good signs of overactivity and underactivity.
Right. And so
that's what makes constipation, right?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, your poogles.
The poogles, yes.
Or in our football players, we call it the tight asses. So could we then touch on, as Pilates instructors, a lot of Pilates instructors, as they step into the profession, are thinking that this is all, Pilates is all about the core. It's so much more complex and such a bigger picture than that when we, stop zooming in so much and start stepping out. But continuing with that, with the relationship of pelvic floor, could we step on up and talk about the diaphragm? Because, pelvic floor is associated with the diaphragm. So in one of your articles, you talk about the diaphragm and you say that, where am I? I think you say like when a muscle is facilitated, does that mean that when it's tight? What does that mean?
Muscle just means that it's tight. It could be overworking or underworking.
When it's facilitated.
Facilitated means that it's neurologically overactive.
Okay.
So you can't use the word facilitated and tight. Facilitated and many things are not synonymous. No.
Okay.
Facilitated is the neurological state. So when I say something is facilitated or overworking, it means the brain is putting too much neural energy into that part of the body. So if I found that the diaphragm was overworking and the pelvic floor was underworking, I would say that the diaphragm was facilitated and the pelvic floor was inhibited.
Okay. Is that a common relationship?
Not always true.
Right.
That's that particular neurological state for that person. So I don't like to generalize with terms. I just use them on an individual by individual basis. And I think a lot of people, when they train, they only learn like formulas, right? Well, formulas don't work for everybody.
Mm-mm.
And that, we're finding here in this country, we call it physical therapy, you call it physiotherapy. We're finding here that the physiotherapists are getting way too formulaic and it just come back in and do the same thing over and over again. I mean, why? Why would you do that? Right? If it ain't working, change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what NKT is all about. It's tailoring your treatment and then the homework assignments based on that person. And we know that through our testing. So people respond well to that. And you don't have to come back over and over and over again. Many people I only see once. Some people I see twice. So if they do their homework, they can take care of themselves, right? The word doctor in Greek means teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a whole lot of teaching going on in the medical profession. So we're teaching people.
I love it. My friend Madeline Black says, it's similar. If something's not working for somebody, don't keep hitting the dead dog against the wall thinking that you're going to wake it up. The dog is dead. Move on.
Madeline lives very near me.
Oh, true.
Yeah, she's about half an hour, 40 minutes away.
Oh, nice. Yeah, she's a good friend. So talking about the diaphragm, what is good breathing and how would the diaphragm affect other parts of the body?
Whew. Well, the diaphragm is tied into every part of the body. So a big question. Proper breathing is the 360 breathing, the Pilates breathing, where the ribs go out before anything else happens. Now, if you watch an animal breathe, a baby breathe, that's how they breathe, right? They breathe wide ribs and then the belly and the chest follow suit, right? So a lot of people have learned yoga belly breathing and they don't move their ribs at all. That's not okay. And then you get stressed out people with chest breathing. And of course, that's even worse, right? So you have a lot of different ways of breathing, but the one that I learned from Pilates when I did Pilates as a client was that 360 breathing. I think it's brilliant. And that's how everybody should breathe. But getting them to be able to breathe like that is another story, right? Because you're asking somebody to change a pattern that they've been doing 20,000 times a day for years and years and years and years. So it takes practice and patience to change breathing into the 360 breathing. But it's critical. It's really critical. So let's say the diaphragm is overworking. Well, why would it it overworks often for weak core, weak transverse abs, weak rectus abdominis, weak obliques, weak QLs. The posterior diaphragm it affects the quadratus lumborum, which, pulls the rig down, muscle of expiration. So there are a lot of ways that an overactive diaphragm can affect the body. Underactive diaphragm, wow, you're going to the hospital. If you can't use your diaphragm, you better go to the hospital. Yeah. So there are dysfunctional diaphragm muscles, but I never find one that's truly, truly inhibited unless you're comparing the four lobes of the diaphragm to itself. Then one of the lobes may be overactive and another underactive. But that's the little nitpicky stuff that we get into in more advanced than KT. Not necessary for movement people, to understand that right away. But yes, parts of the diaphragm can work harder than others. Just like the pelvic floor, parts of the pelvic floor can work harder than other parts of the pelvic floor. But that's an advanced concept. And for tonight, let's just stick to the basics here, the meat and potatoes here, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Diaphragm for beginner students, just think of it as overactive. It's always, if you find something in relation to the diaphragm, it's working too hard.
And so when you talk about that 360 breathing, and we also practice that, but again, just to make this very clear for our listeners, my interpretation of that is, a lot of new Pilates instructors will understand the lateral breathing. So think of filling up your rib cage on the sides, but we also want to expand through the front and through the back to really encourage for the diaphragm to expand in all directions, and for that higher entire cavity to expand in all directions. Is that what I'm thinking?
Yes, I agree with you completely. But you can't have that unless you initiate lateral rib breathing. You can't get any of those other things. If you do belly breathing, that won't happen. If you do chest breathing, that will not happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's a beautiful breath that widens the rib cage and allows for that full expansion of the diaphragm and full trajectory of the diaphragm. That is what we ideally want for everybody, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
If you want to make yourself crazy, go to a public park or the airport and watch children breathe the way their parents breathe, and it's shocking. I have to turn that part of my brain off when I travel. I make myself crazy in there, right? So I don't do that.
So could we move? Well, I would love then, in my mind, when I'm thinking of the core, of course, pelvic floor, diaphragm, what about the psoas? If we think of like its role in stability and the global relationships of the psoas, I feel like as a Pilates instructor, we don't necessarily learn about the psoas until we've been teaching for a couple of years. Like we learn about the basics, but once we hear about the psoas, then a lot of instructors want to know more. So let's touch on it.
Sure. When I first started posting about the psoas, my motto was, don't stretch the psoas. 90% of the time, the psoas is underactive. And if you stretch it, even though it's tight, it rebounds against that because you're further destabilizing it by stretching it. And the psoas is such an important part of the core. It's the only muscle that attaches to the discs, to the lumbar disc. So if you have a tight psoas, it can pull on the disc, but you want to know, why is it tight? Is it overworking or underworking? And most people just go in there and dig away on the psoas, or they get that ridiculous psoas hook thing that you lie on and torture yourself with. And that's doing more people harm than good. So I get a lot of people come in my clinic who have been releasing the psoas because they have lower back pain, and they continue with lower back pain because that psoas isn't firing at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something very important to understand how the psoas works, right? So it has two basic functions, right? It's a hip flexor, and it's a core. To me, it's a core muscle because it does attach to the lumbars.
Mm-hmm.
So it has many global relationships. The one that people go crazy on me over is psoas to TMJ, psoas to the jaw. Now, I got called a liar and all kinds of things about that for a long time. Not anymore. But the psoas and the jaw have a very distinct relationship, especially through the temporalis muscles and the masseter muscles, which are muscles of mastication, right? And they also can lock up when we're tense and emotionally distressed. So a lot of times I find jaw muscles overworking, so as underworking. I mean, the main one that we see, of course, is the quadratus lumborum overworking and the psoas underworking. That's one of the key components to lower back pain. You can also see the diaphragm overworking and the psoas underworking. That's a very, very common relationship. But one I really like a lot that has to do with flight or fight in the sympathetic nervous system, scalenes and psoas.
Mm.
The scalenes control the cervical plexus up here, and the psoas controls the lumbar plexus. So they both get activated during stress. The whole sympathetic system does. And oftentimes we find them in bad relationship to each other. And once you reestablish that relationship, like scalenes are overworking, psoas underworking, you can help relieve a lot of stress in the body because then the sympathetic isn't all jacked up. And people now are trying to stimulate their parasympathetic nervous systems, right? And there's all kinds of courses about that and articles. And it is very, very important. But if what's shutting it down isn't addressed first, it's hard to then do these exercises that stimulate the parasympathetic without first taking care of what's causing sympathetic.
And is that partly because the psoas is, it's, well, I remember doing some workshops with a woman called Liz Kosh, and she works with psoas, and she talked about the psoas being out your fight or flight responder. Is that part of that?
That is exactly right, because it is controlling the lumbar plexus, and the amount of nerves going through the psoas and through the lumbar plexus is astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the anatomy of that, there are a lot of nerves going through there. So of course, if the psoas gets all jacked up, nerve flow is going to be, restricted, and it can lead to flight or fight kind of feelings. Absolutely.
Right. And so is it fair to say...
Just like the skin.
Right. And so is it fair to say, when you said about, people getting the psoas palpated or, laying on those, those psoas release tools, is that just going to initiate that fight or flight response because it stresses that part of the body out?
If they are already stressed to begin with and the psoas is weak and tight and all that, and you lie on one of those things, you're going to mess yourself up pretty good.
Right. And then, well, I don't know if this is right or not, but this is how I perceive it to happen, is then it ends up almost, instead of the psoas being nourished and juicy and fluid and hydrated, it ends up, because it's stressed, it dries out and then stops having that beautiful rebound effect that it's meant to have. Is that fair?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. A lot of people think the psoas is a spiritual muscle. So I looked the word up in Greek. It means loin muscle. It's filet mignon. That's what
I know. Right. If I was going to eat you, I'm going to eat your psoas, right? It's the best part of it's the best cut of meat.
Right. That's right. And you don't want it all dried up. You want a juicy psoas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to get a juicy psoas, it has to be able to lengthen and contract. It has to be able to function. But if you're just beating it up because it's tight, you're doing it a terrible disservice, and you're doing that person a terrible disservice.
And then does the psoas also share dura with the diaphragm? So then breathing, that whole body breathing.
Well, the psoas, the quadratus lumborum, and the diaphragm all come together in the upper lumbar spine,
mm-hmm.
in the crus of the diaphragm.
Right.
So, they have a huge effect on each other. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody's really stressed out and their breathing becomes very short, and chest breathing and whatnot, it'll have an effect on the psoas and the quadratus lumborum as well. A lot of mid-back pain can be attributed to the posterior diaphragm being super, super tight and the quadratus lumborum not functioning properly.
Okay, it's so fascinating, isn't it? Like just
Yeah, the diaphragm is just crazy. It affects the oblique muscles or breathing muscles. We do a whole section of our level 2 on breathing, and there are muscles that are accessory muscles of breathing. The diaphragm and the intercostals, of course, are the primary muscles. But then you have the muscles of inhalation, the scalenes, the sternocleidomastoids, the pec minor. And then you have the muscles of exhalation, which are the obliques and the rectus abdominis and the quadratus lumborum. So those can get into a funky relationship to each other. And we explore that, like scalenes to obliques and SCMs to abdominals and scalenes to QL. And we look at all that stuff, which makes, then breaking down breathing patterns much more sophisticated and right on. And you can give somebody homework based on that. So we spend a lot of time on breathing, Katie, a lot of time.
I love that. And and what I'm hearing is, is not looking at the isolation of something, is looking at the relationship of everything. It's taking a step back and looking at the body as a whole and not just getting stuck on this, your lower back is tight, so let's work on your lower back. It's okay, your lower back is tight. What is the relationship of other parts of the body where we might be able to help relieve that to create function?
That's right. So I tell my students the most important question is why? Why is that muscle tight? Not let me beat the crap out of it. Why is it tight? So, massage schools and a lot of other things teach just to work on tight muscles, but they're ignoring the fact that could be weak and tight, maybe it's strong and tight. You don't know if you should release it or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So NKT allows you to determine if you should, in fact, release a tight muscle or you should activate. And it can make a huge difference in treatment outcomes. Huge difference.
Right. And so with that in mind, thinking of a tight muscle, because, is it tight because it's working too much? Is it tight because it's not working enough? So in general, should we be stretching or strengthening a tight muscle?
You should be testing it to see what its neurological condition is first. Yeah. Because you can't tell by palpation and you really can't tell by movement. You can get an idea, but you have to identify which one it is by testing.
Right.
So some very simple tests at the beginning of a Pilates intake session can give you a tremendous amount of information.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at how they stand, are they pronating? Are they supinating? How are they breathing? Those are, what's their balance like? Those are things you can learn a lot from and break it down very easily with some testing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to muscle imbalances or pain or dysfunction, what role do you think emotion plays in that experience?
That goes back to Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am, which has to be some of the stupidest words ever spoken by the human race. How can emotions in the body be separate to begin with? Well, it's all one thing. You have to see everything as one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, emotions can wreak havoc on your body, and your body can wreak havoc on your emotions. It goes both ways, right? But we find that our work is the least successful and needs therapy first if somebody has a severe case of PTSD, because the brain then can't accept any changes to the way it sees movement. So at the very top of motor control, which is how the brain organizes movement, is the limbic system. So if the limbic system is completely messed up from trauma, neurokinetic therapy won't work. You'll be treating the same thing over and over and over and over again, and you won't make anybody better. People who are super limbic, they go to therapy first before I ever touch them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you
It's too,
familiar with John Sarno's work?
what's that?
Are you familiar with John Sarno?
John Sarno, of course.
Yeah. So is that the type that, because, he also talks about, I mean, he obviously wasn't a surgeon, but then was realizing, these people are coming back, he works on one part of the body. And if the limbic system isn't dealt with as a top priority, then that pain will just move to a different part of the body. We need to deal with the trauma, deal with the emotions first.
That's right. Sure. So that's at the top of motor control is the limbic system. So that has to be addressed. And some people are somewhat PTSD or somewhat traumatized, in which case, when you're working on them, they can start to emote based on where you're touching them and where they're holding all that emotion, right? So it can work that way as well. So if I don't think that person is super limbic and I start working on them, I remember a woman, I worked on her triceps, and the next thing I know, she's hysterically crying, remembering how her father would throw her on the ground and rape her, So uh, every cell in the body is capable of memory and holding emotion. And we have to be very respectful and very cognizant of that in order really to treat the whole person. So you can't separate any of this stuff, Katie. That's the problem with Western medicine. They decided to separate every damn thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work that way. So again, once I saw the interconnectedness of everything, I could never look at anything the same way again.
Right. Yeah, I'm all with you as well. I feel like, maybe, as a movement educator, maybe what happens is, understanding, the basis, just the basics of Pilates, of movement, the basics of anatomy, it's a foundation, but then we have to start looking further than that, and I think, as your career progresses, you start to see some similarities, but so many uniqueness in the bodies that you work with that it leads you towards the path of what you have also explored.
That's correct. And that should be the same in anybody's practice, whether they're a movement person or, a massage person or whatever they might be, a palpation person. You've got to incorporate everything in order to really understand what you're doing. And that takes years and years and years of practice.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not an overnight miracle. All of a sudden you can see everything, right? It takes a lot of practice. But I think it's good that students know all this ahead of time so that when they do encounter a situation like that, they can be prepared for it. So my first treatment that I got paid for, guy came in and he had really tight shoulders. And I started doing some pressure points in his upper trapezius on both sides. And the next thing I know, he's flopping on my table like a dead fish. And his mouth is like, okay. And it took about 10 minutes for him to unwind. And I looked at him and I said, what the hell was that? And he said, I was reliving my electroshock therapy. So I went home and watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest again. And damn, that's exactly what everybody did. It blew me away. I thought, I'm going to have a really interesting career if this is my first one right out of the gate. So yes, that's what happened to me on my first session. So have I appreciated that very much? Yeah, it's
So, what are some key insights or lessons that you've learned through your experiences in working with neurokinetic therapy?
key insights. Well, don't assume. Don't assume. Take everybody as an individual, right? That's so important. And when somebody comes in and they've tried everything, do something else. Do something else. I had a client come in. She was messed up for like 4 or 5 years. She had pain all over her body. She had been here, been there, been tested with everything. And I asked her, has anybody checked your dural tube, which is, the hard matter that surrounds the spinal cord, right? It connects your sacrum to your occiput and to your brain. So I started working on her dural tube, and in one session, she improved so much, she was just in tears afterwards. It was the first time somebody treated it differently. And she'd been poked and prodded and tested, and it didn't work. So she got her life back, basically, because I want to do the same thing again that everybody else said. Now, why? Why would you do that? Right? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Don't keep pushing that rock up a hill. Roll it down the other side.
Yeah, and I feel like for new movement educators, it's you kind of start with this little toolkit of this is all I know. Well, it's okay. Try that, but if it doesn't work, put that information in your pocket, and then that information of something not working becomes a new part of the toolkit.
That's correct. I mean, I created all these tests for NKT by failure. I learned everything by failure. So if you're afraid to fail, you can't succeed. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So I always tell my students, how many of you in this class were allowed to fail when you were in school? Of course, nobody raises their hands. And I say to them, how the hell did you learn anything? Because that's how we learn. We learn movement. Think about a baby trying to stand up for the first time. How many times do they fall before their brain pieces together enough successful moves to make them stand up, right? Well, that's failure to success. And we've made failure such a bad word, and it's not a bad. It's part of learning. So I get people coming up to me after a class. They could be in their 50s. They're kinesthetic learners. They felt stupid all their lives. And because we address the way that they learn, all of a sudden they feel smart. And they grab me and they start crying and thanking me because they actually can learn. It's just the way we're educated is a complete, traffic wreck. It's a wreck. It's a disaster for the human spirit. Everybody needs to fail and learn from failure. Everybody needs to feel comfortable failing. And everybody needs to know that they learn. They might not learn as quickly as the person next to them, but they might become a better practitioner because they had to work harder to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've learned a lot of things by teaching too.
Yeah, I bet. And I feel like it's also that, it's okay to fail, but B, success comes from just the consistency of putting the time in. You don't have, it's not about, having to be the best from the get-go. You can be super average for a long, 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 long time, but if you keep putting the work in, then you will gain those insights and you will understand things and you will make a change.
That's right. And some of my most brilliant practitioners started off that way, had to repeat classes, but boy, when they got it, they were magnificent, just truly magnificent. And that makes me smile more than anything. Yeah, watching somebody really work hard to get good at something, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I bet. What have been some of the some more of the most rewarding aspects of the work that you do? Like, you obviously enjoy teaching teachers or enjoy the educating side of it.
Well, of course, I write about it every day, just about. So I've enjoyed the writing part of it too. Yeah, that brings out another side of me because I'm trying to say something complex in the simplest of terms and as few words as possible. So I enjoy doing that. I enjoy compacting whatever it is into, smaller bites. So you're back?
I'm back.
Yeah, you're back. Yeah, I enjoy that. But the teaching is really a wonderful thing. And then I watch my assistant teachers take over for me and listen and hear them teach. Wow, watch them teach. It's like, it feels so good.
Mm-hmm.
It feels so good. To help others through others is a special gift that I've gotten to enjoy, right? And there's some burden that comes with that, and I take my responsibility very seriously. But I get a whole lot of, when my head hits the pillow at night, I can think to myself, I might have helped 50,000 people today.
Mm.
That's a hell of a feeling. That's a hell of a,
I
and
bet.
my life has been very rewarding, very, very rewarding. I'm very happy that I chose to do what my heart wanted me to do and not listen to my brain. This is stupid. This is smart. And when you come to realize that, you get a whole lot wiser all of a sudden, you know? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the lesson. Follow your heart and use your brain when necessary, but not too much. Keep it parked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, hear ye. Well, I have one more question for you, David. Yeah, probably with that in mind, if you could have a conversation with your younger self now that you've learned all that you know about the body, what would you say to yourself? Like, you've had years of practice. What would you say to yourself?
I would say to myself, you're going to have a lot of fun doing what you're thinking about doing. Go ahead and enjoy it. I've really professionally, very few regrets. I feel blessed that I was one of those people that got to follow my heart, and became successful doing so. So I don't know how many of us are out there. I wish there were more and more and more people who felt that way, but I couldn't do something that didn't feel right to my soul, my spirit, my heart. It was too offensive. And my family got really mad at me, but I had to do what I had to do. And a lot of people get caught up in family expectations, societal expectations. Do what you want to do. Do what you want to do and help people, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Buddha said that he created Buddhism to help the suffering of the world, right? So I take that kind of seriously. I think it's all of our jobs to ease as much suffering in the world as we possibly can, whether that's through what I do, through Pilates, whatever the system you may engage in. Your job is to improve the quality of people's lives and make people's lives richer, more satisfying. And it's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's my old hippie boy talking to you there.
I love it. Service to others, that surely that's what we're here for.
Surely. Yeah. I don't take that for granted.
Thank you so much, David. Yes.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. You are a wealth of information. Now, everybody, in the show notes, of course, we will have information for you to get in contact with David, to follow David's work. You can find David online, Neurokinetic Therapy. David has plenty of online resources, and he does write really amazing articles as well. So I highly recommend you start reading the musings that come out of David's heart.
Instagram. That's what most people are doing.
Oh, great. What is your Instagram handle?
You won't believe this, David Weinstock.
Easy to find, David Weinstock, Weinstock. That will also be in the show notes. Thank you so much again, David. I love this conversation, and I know that our listeners will. My name's Katie Crane, the Pilates professional. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the Pilates Lounge podcast. Thank you so much, David.